Wendy Blum. I've been a Needham resident since 1983. I love the town, and it was such a great place to raise my children. But as I started learning more about past discrimination and current policies that make Needham feel a bit like a gated community with little diversity economically and racially, I was moved to join Equal Justice in Needham. It's an informal group of people working to make Needham more equitable, accessible, and welcoming to all kinds of people. If you want to learn more, please visit the website equaljusticeneedham.org.
Hi, my name's Noah Mertz, and welcome to Moving Forward Together. I'll be your host tonight. Equal Justice in Needham was founded in solidarity with national protests over racial injustices in our policing. We have since embarked on a project to reimagine public safety in Needham. Our vision is of a town that is safe for all, including residents, employees, and visitors who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. In 2 public safety reports we have authored, EJN has identified significant racial disparities in police outcomes and large gaps in good governance when it comes to policing in Needham. We have made specific recommendations around transparency, accountability, and more rigorous data-based oversight of the police. We are currently working to push our town government to act upon these recommendations. Our commitment to a more just Needham that is safe for everyone is only reinforced by our solidarity with Mr. Marvin Henry, an innocent Black man publicly handcuffed for over 30 minutes outside of our local Starbucks in Needham Heights. Despite acknowledging his innocence, more than a year later, there has been no consequence for the officers involved in his wrongful arrest and no formal restitution or direct apology to Mr. Henry himself. EJN's analysis of data and Mr. Henry's case remind us that police misuse of force happens here too, and that as a town, we can and we need to do better. So tonight we have some amazing panelists joining us. We have Katie Ryan, who is the Chief of Staff at Campaign Zero, an organization that aims to end police violence nationwide through systemic and data-driven reforms. We have Rebecca Waber, a co-author of Equal Justice in Needham's Reimagining Public Safety reports. We have Stephanie Hartung, professor at Northeastern University School of Law and trustee of the New England Innocence Project. So Katie, where does a small town like Needham fit into the national conversation around race and public safety?
First of all, I want to extend my deepest gratitude for the invitation to be here today in such a timely conversation, especially given that I think it was less than an hour ago that we learned about the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin, which is helping elevate the conversation about law enforcement accountability and ensuring that communities are highly involved in both accountability and discipline procedures. So again, thank you for the invitation, and the timing is more appropriate now than ever. In terms of a small town like Needham, a lot of people think that conversations about police accountability, more restrictive practices, policies, and oversight are most applicable to larger areas or more densely populated or urban areas throughout the United States. But in fact, it's actually quite the opposite. One of the things that we learned, and we learned from Campaign Zero, we collect data around police killings around the United States. And since we started collecting this data in 2013, 2020 was the highest year of police or officer-involved killings in the United States since 2018, which is particularly scary given that so many people were on lockdown. But one of the more interesting findings in that data subset is that when you looked at where these killings were occurring across the country, in fact, killings by police officers is on a slight decline in urban areas, right? The overall number is increasing slightly, but the spikes in police killings are actually occurring in suburban areas across the United States, which means Needham sits pretty squarely in an area of concern, or where we would see and want to monitor more closely and see action in terms of promoting police accountability. There's several hypotheses for why it is that suburban killings are on the upswing, but one of them is just that larger urban areas are getting so much attention, right? Like the transparency, the push for increased transparency and increased accountability is high in Los Angeles, Chicago. The microscope is on, people are in the streets protesting. And then when we look at smaller suburban areas, there might not be as loud of an outcry. And so that sometimes means there's less oversight, which means that there is more opportunity, shall we say, for law enforcement misconduct to go unchecked. And so I think it's brilliant that Needham is a community that is saying, look, we might be a smaller area of the country, and yet it's incredibly important to raise awareness about the practices that our law enforcement officers operate under and have more civilian engagement, oversight, and transparency.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think, Rebecca, you're going to speak a little bit to what's been going on in Needham thus far since the George Floyd uprising last summer.
I think in Needham, there have been a lot of really important conversations starting to be had where people are asking questions around what is policing like in Needham and what are opportunities to be better. And I think those are the right questions to be asking. One of the things that I think is really interesting right now is how hard it's been to answer those questions, actually. So I'm a town meeting member, and last summer, we had a big conversation at town meeting around the role of policing in the context of a conversation about the budget, because we were talking about adding a couple more officers to the force and buying new firearms. And because that was in the context of all of the Black Lives Matter conversation and protests going on, there was a pretty robust conversation. But there really was a lack of data, and people were having very different kinds of assumptions about what policing in Needham might look like. And so as part of EJN, I was involved in a public records request to get data from our police department to understand, well, what is policing like? Because that seems like step one in being able to have a conversation as a town about where there could be opportunities to be better. And so this was a very lengthy multi-month, more than $1,000 type effort in getting data from our police department, where we asked questions like, how often do we handcuff people? How often do we use weapons? What weapons do we have? Who are we arresting? And so forth. And the list of questions we asked and data and report are all available for anyone to look at. For me, one of the most interesting things is how much work it took for our police department to be able to know the answer to these questions. It took many months. It took quite a lot of manual labor, that there really aren't easy ways to kind of track over time what's going on in terms of, are there racial discrepancies with police interactions, which we found there were. And we looked at everything from arrests to handcuffing to school resource officer interactions, and consistently across all these measures, Black and Hispanic individuals were involved at rates that were far higher than our population in Needham or the population in Metro West. So that is concerning, and that is something to look into. We also found that many of our policies are outdated or perhaps not being followed thoroughly. For example, we have a policy that states that there has to be a racial bias review annually to see if there's any racial bias issues, but those reports have not happened for the years that we asked for that. So I think that's, why is that? For example, the use of force policy didn't have much to say on the topic of de-escalation or the topic of safety for all involved. So there were a number of opportunities to improve. And we hope that this report can really start that conversation, a fact-based kind of grounded conversation in how we can be better and kind of come together around that as a goal.
The first campaign that EJN kind of came around was this phrase, "This happens here," which was all of the attention was focused on Minneapolis and LA, these like urban centers where there are these high profile cases of police abuse of force. And that's important to acknowledge. But there's also a lot that we need to look at here in Needham. And I think Stephanie is going to talk a little bit about an instance of like questionable policing practices in Needham that occurred not that long ago.
Sure. Thanks, Noah, and thanks for having me today. As Noah mentioned, I'm a Needham resident for 20 years now, and have been so impressed and pleased with the work of EJN, and it makes me really proud to be part of this community. The Marvin Henry incident in Needham, you know, on one level, it really illustrates some of the problems that Rebecca and her team have worked on in their data collection and the public safety report. And in particular, you know, it's an individual narrative as to how some of these racial disparities play out. For those people in Needham who think, you know, I live here, I've never seen this. I don't think that there are inequities. I just don't think it happens. The data, and then in combination with this particular incident, show that it in fact does. And so in addition to the way Mr. Henry was treated, you know, showing the racial disparities in policing in the community, I think what happened after is equally as important, because Needham's in a moment where we have the opportunity to do a bit more of a reckoning around our policing in our own town. And instead, unfortunately, what's happened so far is that the town hired outside counsel to conduct an investigation, and they did a very thorough investigation, wrote a lengthy report, but instead of looking at this report in a full and kind of contemplative way, the select board cherry-picked the least damning aspect of the report, which was that the investigators could not find a basis for racial bias in the police officers' actions. And then they dismissed and ignored the rest of the report, which highlights some critical issues with how Mr. Henry was treated and how the Needham Police Department responded to the incident overall. So that aftermath is just as important. And, you know, what do we do now as a community to address what went on there?
The report found that we've handcuffed 400 people in the last 3 years. We were looking at 3 years of data. That, you know, that's a pretty big number, you know, 400 people. And I'm not saying that 400 people have had an identical story to Mr. Henry, but I think it just kind of, you know, you have these individual examples, and then you see that, you know, it's probably not the only one of its kind when you look at the numbers we can get.
Thank you all for speaking to basically where we are in Needham right now. We're starting to understand better where we are as a town with regard to policing, but there's still a lot more that we need to look into and investigate and hopefully change. So my next question is, what do we need to do to make Needham a town that is more welcoming and safe for all? So this gets sort of to the more expansive understanding of public safety.
One effort that can be adopted quickly, like as in tomorrow, and requires, you know, does not have to be legislated, is for police departments to adopt more restrictive use of force policies. And we've seen this is actually the tide of national movement right now. Since George Floyd was killed, for example, last summer, since June of 2020, we've seen 15 states at the statewide level adopt more restrictive use of force policies, some components of which actually have occurred in Massachusetts at the statewide level, and 340 cities that have adopted more restrictive use of force policies. I want to be really clear that in and of itself is not like, it does not end police violence and increase accountability. But to Rebecca's point earlier, it makes a policy or puts teeth in place to expectations for the way in which law enforcement officers are expected to engage with the public. And until we have hard and fast expectations that place the sanctity of life and dignity at the forefront, the data that we're tracking, right, is not necessarily useful, right? If the standard is so low for use of force, a use of force reporting is not particularly useful. That said, I did sort of a cursory review of the Needham Police Department use of force policy, and of the 8 provisions that we track that we know contribute to lessening police officer violence and abuse, Needham meets 3 of 8 of those policies. So there is some significant room for growth there, including reinforcing de-escalation training, actually codifying that in policy. Right now, Needham states that there is a de-escalation training expectation, but there is no explicit expectation that that training would actually be brought to fruition or be implemented in the way that officers engage with the community. Another policy that's missing would be to require officers, when feasible, to actually use all lesser means of force available to them prior to resorting to physical force or deadly force. That currently doesn't exist in the policy. And also more comprehensive reporting. Rebecca pointed out that handcuffing is not currently defined as a use of force. Neither is pointing a firearm at an individual in Needham. So whereas as civilians, if we point a firearm at someone and threaten their life or their safety, that's aggravated assault. But in Needham right now, there is no requirement that officers would report that data. And again, this is something where a collective decision could be made. The chief of police could make this decision. The mayor could make this decision. And these policies could be updated and made more restrictive tomorrow.
This is not about blaming individual people or police officers or our select board or, this is not saying that anyone is a bad person who has done something wrong. This is about coming together as a town to say, we see in our systems and our policies that there is risk and that there is an opportunity to close that risk, to be better, to elevate the sanctity of safety. There's a lot of people in town who are excited to have this conversation. There's also a lot of people who I think are feeling really defensive about the conversation, and I can understand where that's coming from. But I think when we think about the conversation that would be really great to have with the town, with town government, with the police, just being really clear that we're all kind of here for the right reasons. We all have, the goals of public safety for everyone. And I think that's important to remember.
Two additional points I'd make. One about data transparency and also oversight. And, on the data transparency front, I think it's really notable that Rebecca and her team at EJN in collecting this data, as she noted, they ran into delays from the Needham police because they had not collected the data along racial lines in the past around some of these issues that were being requested. And so it took them a lot of time. And what that tells us is that it's not something that they're looking at because they're not collecting it in a systematic way. So there's a movement toward police accountability data dashboards around the country in different jurisdictions. And this is certainly something that Needham could take on so that it would be readily available. Who's being arrested, detained, handcuffed, and what are the basic breakdowns along racial, ethnic, gender lines, et cetera. And so that's one point. I think we could work toward increasing data transparency. As far as oversight, again, this is a movement happening in police departments around the country, both big and urban and small towns like Needham and everything in between. But if you look at what happened in the Marvin Henry incident and the way the Needham Police Department addressed their own behavior, there was an internal affairs investigation that involved members of the same police department and colleagues of the people who were being investigated. And they pretty handily came to the conclusion of no racial bias at one point by merely asking the officers who were involved, were you motivated by racial bias? And the officers said no. And that was followed by a conclusion that no, there was no bias. And so of course, this kind of investigation is not as robust as it could be. And I think it makes sense for Needham to move forward with more of an external oversight body of some kind, in addition to just an internal affairs department within the police.
Thanks, Stephanie. I also just want to mention that I believe the Needham Police Department has agreed to a dashboard, as far as I know. But something I would like to see, I don't know if this is happening in other towns, would be some sort of like mandated annual report from the police. So it's not just a matter of like putting the data out there, but actually hearing their take on it and making sure that they're reading it and actually understanding what these numbers mean. And that's a public service too to the people of the town who maybe are not adept at reading these, facts and figures and whatnot. So that I hope to see something like that down the line. And I have a bit of a follow-up question here. We have a new police reform bill at the state level in Massachusetts. It was recently signed into law. Should Needham be waiting for the enforcement of that law, or are there things that we can start doing right now without waiting? What do you think, Katie?
I always believe you act in response to what's in the best interest of your community, right? To have something sort of mandated or legislated at a statewide level is a floor, and really means that Needham actually has an opportunity to blaze a trail in what it looks like to extend that legislation and also make it more catered to what the community is calling for. Noah, to your point earlier about data transparency and collection, that's not necessarily everything that you want to capture is not necessarily captured in the Massachusetts statewide law. Why not have Needham work with civilians or some level of independent oversight community or task force to actually determine what is it that Needham civilians are interested in learning more about? How can they provide support, reviewing the data and coming to conclusions that would support law enforcement, sort of close the schism or build a wider bridge, shall we, between community and law enforcement? So there would be no reason to wait. And in fact, there's quite a fantastic opportunity in front of you for the community to forge ahead and actually be more innovative.
The thing that my mind was going to was the topic of mental health. Not exactly your question, Noah, but a very important topic, tangential to the policing conversation in general, and also one that I know was very much on the mind of Needham citizens. That was sort of the top topic at town meeting when we were talking about policing. And it's also one that I know that the Needham police have talked about being really critical. 10% of policing incidents have a mental health component, but we're, our training when it comes to mental health, there is a mental health first aid course that all officers have taken, but we only have 20%, for example, who are trained in crisis intervention. Well, we do have a part-time social worker, for example. So this whole topic is definitely on the minds of the community, to your point, Katie, in terms of what the community is looking at, and also our police force itself. Some of the policies around mental health, I know I felt pretty concerned with when I was reading, again, sort of these themes of de-escalation not necessarily being there, or training not necessarily being there to understand, well, what do you do if someone is in a mental health crisis, they're acting strangely, and maybe they're trying to hurt themselves. What do you do in order to keep everybody safe in a situation like that, which is a difficult kind of question. And so that's one area that I think that we very much need to look into as a town. And so are we really doing everything that we can there to keep everybody safe who might be a mental health issue or a developmental disability issue? I would highlight that as an area for us to lean into as a town.
Thanks, Rebecca. I know we've talked a lot about this difference between an imperative of control versus safety. And I think we need to really think about moving more toward safety and life-affirming public safety in that sort of expansive way that we can understand the term. So Stephanie, any thoughts on what we can start doing right now?
People in Needham who are watching this or interested in this topic and starting to think about it, you can educate yourselves and pay attention to what's happening both in Needham and elsewhere. And there's a lot of excellent Boston Globe coverage these days about the Boston Police Department and efforts at reform there and what the resistance has been, which I think can be really informative in small towns like ours. And, especially in light of the recent Marvin Henry event and the incident and what's happened since, it's ongoing. And I think it's important for people in our town to pay attention and attend select board meetings when policing is going to be discussed, and encourage the select board to read and interact with the excellent public safety report that Rebecca and her team has put together, and start to understand how it impacts policing in our community. Even there was recent reporting in Needham around the budget and what what the police budget goes toward, the increase in budget, what's it going to go toward, and is that what we as a community want? And again, thinking about the shifting paradigm that you mentioned, Noah, of safety versus control. So I think just starting to engage a little bit more in the discussion is the first step.
I want to thank all of our panelists, Katie, Rebecca, and Stephanie, for joining us tonight. Thank you for watching. We hope we'll see you again at some more episodes of this TV series. If you want to check out our website, that is equaljusticeneedham.org. And we would love to hear from you on this topic of reimagining public safety. We actually have a poll on our website that you can find, and you can just answer a few quick questions. So we're trying to get some more community engagement on this issue, and feel free to reach out with any comments or questions. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.